was actually born to two people who themselves were diagnosed with schizophrenia and bipolar in their young adulthood. So I had that legacy kind of informing pretty much my whole life. I was raised by my mother as a single mom up until the age of 5.5. And she just didn't have the support that she needed to raise me on her own. She was heavily, heavily drugged and medicated, and there was a lot going on. There were times when she was out of it and strange people coming in and out of the apartment, and there were a lot of sort of traumatic things that happened in those early years, and she certainly didn't intend for any of that. But it resulted in my being removed from her home when I was 5.5. I went to live with my maternal grandmother and her husband, and I rarely saw my mother after that, and my father wasn't much in the picture at all. And I started expressing suicidal feelings at a very young age. I think maybe when I was 7, I was told that I said, it would have been better if I'd never been born. And I, had that feeling very strongly. I remember that growing up. And at that time, I was sent to see a psychiatrist who really had no experience working with children. She recommended medication, which made me feel horrible, and so luckily my family took me off of that. But when I hit puberty, things started to really kind of unravel with all of that sort of undealt with trauma and just the reality of, living with my grandparents. I just felt really different than everybody else, and I had always just felt like very empty and alone, and I kind of felt like a burden. And so that came out with a lot of sort of depression, kind of acting, isolation, not really communicating much. And so I was, sent back to the mental health system, and they put me on Prozac when it first came out onto the market. I think I was about 13 years old. And those SSRI antidepressants just kind of took my baseline distress, and I had all kinds of unbelievable side effects and racing thoughts, agitation. These were not things that had happened before I was put on these drugs. And my family was told, oh, this is just her condition worsening. And that was the story, all throughout, that, every time I was put on a new drug and I had some kind of adverse reaction to the drug, it was like, oh, her condition is worsening. So that pretty much sent me on a spiral from age 13 to pretty much my adulthood, where I was in and out of institutions. I tried to take my life a number of times. I was diagnosed with depression, borderline personality disorder, bipolar, I forget the exact term, but bipolar tendencies, I guess is what they used. It's just, OCD at one point. And all the while, the medications were really making me sick. I mean, I really remember as soon as I went off, all of the agitation and the restlessness and the sleeplessness and the obsessive thoughts just kind of left, which makes, leads me to think that really, that I just had terrible reactions to SSRI drugs. And when I was in the mental health system, it was just sort of comply, do what you're told, take your meds, follow our schedule. And again, they never dealt with trauma. I had, dabbled in marijuana and drinking, and it was sort of all focused on that, which granted, okay, it's fine to focus on that to some degree, but there was no recognition of the early traumas that I had been through. And so the initial issues that had caused my distress were never addressed in the mental health system. It was just sort of like a warehouse where they threw us all together, these different places, different kids experiencing different forms of abuse in their life and reacting to that, in quite understandable ways. I saw a lot of violence in these youth wards, a lot of kids being taken down by 4 and 5 adults. And that sort of just added to my trauma. And just the feeling that I was broken. And that was the feeling, that was sort of what was always sort of communicated to me. Very little hope. And just, you're a case and you need to be managed. It was sort of like that. And don't hope for too much in your life. Don't wish for too much in your life. And that's kind of what I came out of the institutions with, just this feeling like I'm going to end up a permanent patient and I begged my family to come home, and they said, you know, on the condition that you get into school and, you know, kind of start to get your life on track. And their support really saved me, even when, you know, the professionals were saying, no, you need to leave her in this facility. And I did. I went back to school. I ended up doing very well. At that point, I said, I don't want to be on these medications that are making me feel so terrible. And they agreed to let me come off of those medications. And like I said, the racing thoughts, the obsessiveness all went away when I got off those drugs. And I went to school, I traveled, I got to see the world. I feel very blessed and fortunate that it was almost sort of like academics. My initial love of academics kind of came around to save me. And I think the key thing with that too is once I went to college, I did not have this primary identity as patient any longer. I was a student. I was a student among students. And I didn't talk about what had happened to me. I felt so ashamed and so horrified by my adolescence and my childhood. I just kept a lid on it. And that worked for a time. It worked for a time. But then I really just had this yearning to understand, I think, what the roots of what I had gone through. So I started searching and casting around and ended up going to see this, you know, therapist who, as soon as she heard my family history, said, oh my God, you need to be back on meds immediately. I'm referring you to a psychiatrist right now. And I said, well, you know, I was in my early to mid 20s at this point. I said, you know, those medications really did not work very well for me growing up. And she said, well, you have to read this book called Listening to Prozac by Peter Kramer. Read this book, Listening to Prozac, and it'll completely change your perspective. And so I actually went looking for the book, and instead I found Talking Back to Prozac by Peter Breggin. And it completely opened my eyes to all of the weird adverse effects that I had experienced as a youth that were just explained away as my worsening illness were actually recognized side effects of the medications that I was on that are highly and widely documented, including the increased sort of suicidal feelings and behavior that I had experienced while on those drugs. And so that sort of catapulted me into activism and advocacy on this issue. I got connected with other people in the movement and, you know, sort of trying to promote a different paradigm, you know, where people can actually overcome these things and go on to live wonderful, meaningful lives. And so I've really dedicated the rest of my life to promoting this much more hopeful message, much more hopeful than what I experienced. My parents, both of them died young, which is not surprising because we know that the studies show that people diagnosed with serious mental illness, they die on average 25 years younger than the general population. So my parents were casualties of that. My mother died when she was 46, my father when he was 63, definitely of complications relating to severe over-medication. Each of them were on at least 5 or 6 heavy duty psychiatric drugs. So I have that's my legacy too, is that I, you know, live with the loss of my parents, who I think in many ways were casualties of a very, very broken system.